So we talked in the last lesson about how to create users and groups in Azure AD, and now we want to finish the discussion about how to assign users or groups permissions to access resources. This is done in Azure through what is known as role-based access control, or RBAC. And RBAC, in fact, authorizes every request to access resources, whether you're reading a resource to look at it in the portal or whether you're modifying a resource through the portal or PowerShell or any other way you can access Azure. So the process is to identify the users and groups, identify a role that you want, and roles are tied to resources, and then you assign the user or group to the role to allow access. There are three general roles that exist for every resource: owner, contributor, and reader. The owner can perform any change to the resource. So they also own it, and so the person who creates the resource owns it, so of course they can make any change they need to. The contributor role can perform any change except changing permissions. So they're similar to an owner. They can make any modification to the role or to the resource, but they cannot change who can access the resource. The reader, of course, can only read the resource, cannot modify it. There are many dozens of built-in roles in Azure, some of which are specific to resources. We'll see a list of those momentarily. You can also create your own custom roles. So if there's one in Azure that's not quite what you need, you can modify it, create a custom role, and then simplify your permissions. Let me show you how to do RBAC in the Azure portal. So I'm at my storage account here, and just about every resource in Azure has an access control blade. Access control is where you assign resource permissions and also where you look at role assignments. If I come and look at role assignments here for this storage account, you can see that I've already assigned Chris Green as a contributor for this resource. In fact, the scope of this says resource group and it's inherited. So this is what I was mentioning before, that since all resources belong to a resource group, you can assign permissions at the resource group level, and it really simplifies permissioning. In fact, I'll go up to the resource group level to add a new permission. So at the resource group level, notice there's an access control here as well. Click Add, Role Assignment, and then choose the role. So if I want a user to be a reader of this storage account so they can look at the permissions of the storage account but not modify it, choose that role, and then choose the members. You can either assign roles by user or group. We'll talk about identities later. Under Select Members, maybe I want Sue to be a reader. I select Sue. I can review and assign. And now Sue is allowed to look at everything in this resource group. Other things you can do in the access control blade. Let me go back to the storage account, access control. If you're curious what access someone has to this resource, you can look them up. So here's Sue. And Sue has reader access. It's been inherited from the resource group. You can also see a summary of those role assignments as I showed you before. And here's the list of all the roles that are defined. So this is the list of roles defined for a storage account. You see owner, contributor, reader are the top three, and then there are others based on different kinds of resources. Like a backup contributor would need to be able to access a storage account in order to back up the data. And so everything that you see here is related to storage accounts. If I go up to a higher level, I can also see a list of roles that are appropriate for the resource group. Go back to access control. Here are a list of roles And you can see, I won't scroll all the way through, but you see that there are many, many, many built-in roles relating to all the different roles defined for all the Azure resources you could create, because anything can be put inside of a resource group. Next, let's talk about how to create a custom role. So roles in Azure are stored as JSON files. And the syntax is fairly easy to understand once you hear what a few of the rules are. If you need to create a custom role, the thing to do is start with a role that's similar to what you want and modify it. There's an easy way to do that in the portal that I'll show you in just a moment. So you start with a similar role, you modify the permissions, then you can assign it to a scope. So a scope would either be like a resource group or a subscription, something like that. In the role file itself, there are what are known as management plane permissions. Those are sections called actions and not actions. So management plane is what administrators typically do. So actions are things that they are allowed to do, and the asterisk here means anything. And then not actions are things that this role is not allowed to do administratively. And so as we talked about contributor being similar or almost as much as owner, except what a contributor cannot do is change permissions. And so that's represented in actions by the fact that authorization, which is who can do something with this role, not allowed to write or delete authorizations on this resource. And so that's what prevents the contributor from modifying the list of people who can modify this resource. Under data plane permissions, those are sections that relate to what happens to the data inside a resource. So if it's a storage account, it could be the blobs or the files that are inside it. None are listed for contributor, and so contributor really has no permissions to necessarily access the contents of blobs that are in a storage account. And that can be appropriate in many situations. Let me show you how to create a custom role in the portal. So here I am at EastRG Resource Group. I'm at the Access Control Blade looking at roles. And I know that the contributor permission or role, if I go and look at the JSON file for it, so contributor can do everything except modify authorization and elevate action for authorization. There's a few other permissions related to blueprints and things that we'll talk about later, but that's the basic idea for contributor. Now I'm going to close this and go back because I want to create a new contributor role that's also allowed to modify the contents of blobs. So I'm going to call this a blob manager. I want to clone the contributor role, and now I set permissions for this role. So here's the list that was cloned from contributor. And at this point, I could add others or exclude other permissions. I'm going to add permissions. You do need to know what's called the resource provider or the thing in Azure that's providing these permissions. In our case, it's Microsoft.storage. So here's my storage account. Here's the list of all the actions that are possible with storage. Here's the data actions that are possible with storage. I'm going to scroll down towards the bottom. And I wanted blobs. So I want the ability to read blobs, write blobs, delete blobs. So I can add these data permissions to the list of what's allowed for this custom role. Notice the permission type here is listed as data action. After you fill out the permissions, you click Next, go to the assignable scopes. If I just want this assigned to EastRG, I'm done. If I wanted to change the scope, I could add other scopes, maybe put it at a subscription level if I like. You can review the JSON and notice we'll see all the permissions we saw for contributor. There's actions, there's the not actions we had before. And then under data actions, we've added some additional permissions. Can review and create. And now I have a new role called Blob Manager, and I can use that role and assign users to it. I'm going to look for my role, Blob Manager, there it is. For the purposes of your exam, I would remember things like the syntax and layout of custom role in JSON syntax. So there's a permissions section that contains actions and not actions. Those are things administrators can do. Data actions and not data actions, things that someone can do to the data that might be inside a resource.